Good morning. This is the day that God has made. Look at this room. Over 2,000 people are gathered here. More than one rabbi and more than one priest, and not a few Muslims. What a cross-section of religions and races and cultures and national origins. The United States of America is the most religious country in the West. More than 3/4 of its people believe in some kind of Judeo-Christian God. Moreover, it's the only society in the world where new religions, cults, sects, and therapies, all based upon Christianity, are being invented every day. And no powerful person is more powerful than you.
Religious fervor goes back a long way in America. The ministry that built this high-tech megachurch dates back to the 17th century. It was the early religious missions that played a vital role in the artistic and cultural development of America. What could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men? They looked behind them, and there was the mighty ocean which they had passed and was now as a gulf to separate them from the civil parts of the world. What could sustain them now but the Spirit of God and His grace? So wrote William Bradford after he and his fellow pilgrims landed in 1620 at Plymouth, fleeing religious persecution in England.
In grassy folds He down doth make me lie. He gently leads me quiet waters by. He doth return my soul for His name's sake. In paths of justice leads me quiet lie.
It is now no time to pamper the flesh, live at ease, snatch, catch, scrape and pill and hoard up, but rather to open the doors, the chests and vessels, and say, brother, neighbour, friend, what want ye?
All the year round, tourists come in droves to this late 20th century reconstruction of the first Plymouth colony. After all, the ancestry of about 15 million Americans today began in, or perhaps behind, the lost originals of these primitive huts. Here it is always 1627, 7 years after the Mayflower arrived.
Nothing remains of the original Plymouth, and this is an elaborate facsimile built on the coast nearby, historically, ecologically, and technically accurate down to the last sheep and shoelace and sawpit. The Pilgrims were the most radical wing of 17th century English Puritanism. They were, in effect, the Protestants' Protestants. They regarded mainstream Anglicanism as just as impure and hopelessly corrupt as the Church of Rome, and they wanted to make a fresh start, on a clean slate, over here in the New World.
Almighty Jehovah, we pray that Thou wilt look down upon us this day and hear the prayer of Thy faithful, O Lord. Thou hast oft brought us many blessings here in this wilderness. From our first coming into this land, O Lord, Thou hast brought us out of this wilderness.
You have a well-made house, you have delicious food, you have silverware and books and pottery and everything that domestic life requires. Except, it seems, one thing. I don't see any pictures here. Why is that?
We are not like those Dutchmen. Having lived in Leiden, I can assure you, sir, you might find there fine paintings upon the walls of a man's house. It is a great fashion. I think it is no great ill, though I must say I am well contented with the more simpler life we have in this place.
But in particular, you don't have any pictures of what, of the kind that a Catholic might have, the pictures of Jesus and the saints. And
the shrines and relics. This is all a great superstition unto mankind, and much of the work of the devil. blinding men with things of man's art, and keeping man from the proper reverence unto God.
The first colonists in the 17th century saw the unexplored land as a blank slate on which they could write their designs and find their chance to create utopia. And their visions of what such a place might mean have left indelible traces on the identity of modern America. The wilderness was untamed, they were right about that, but it was not no man's land. To about 12 million American Indians, it was home. And the first big cultural collision between colonist and native took place here in the desert tablelands of the Southwest. Charged with the hunger for conquest, just 50 years after Columbus, the Spaniards marched north to what would be known as New Mexico. The Spaniards thought they would find infinite gold as Cortés and his conquistadores had in Old Mexico. They hoped that paradise was here for the taking. They'd heard talk of golden cities, the 7 cities of Cibola, but instead they found tribal Indians living in multi-story villages, the Pueblo Indians. They had pottery, but not gold. The Spanish never did find gold. But on their wild goose chase after non-existent treasure, they at last arrived at the foot of Sky City, the ancient city of Acoma. One bemused Spaniard called it the greatest stronghold ever seen in the world. With its 2,000 dwellings, this is the oldest continuously populated city in North America. The Acomas had lived here for 1,000 years before the Spanish arrived. For them, it was a sacred place, but not for the invaders. In 1599, the Spanish massacred most of the Acomas and sold the rest into slavery. Yet the Acomas built up their community again, and their descendants were persuaded by the Franciscan missionaries to build an immense shrine on the rock to their god, the Catholic God. The Church of San Esteban was finished by the 1720s. By then, it was by far the largest mission church in all of New Mexico, with its immense cyclopean walls 10 feet thick at the base and its 150-foot-long nave, all of it entailing something like 20,000 tons of rock and clay, every ounce of which had to be brought up from the valley floor below on people's backs because there wasn't any loose fill on top of the mesa. Indian labor, Spanish techniques. The basic unit of San Esteban is the mud brick, the adobe, a simple technology which the Spaniards had brought with them from the Old World. Because the adobe is only dried mud, the rain melts it and it is in constant need of repair. The repeated coats of mud produce singular organic forms that are the signature of the adobe style, as in this church at Ranchos de Taos. "70 years ago, these fluid shapes would inspire the work of modernist artists like Georgia O'Keeffe. The pure and primal character of the southwestern desert would draw her and other artists from New York, looking for the primitive, as Gauguin was drawn to Tahiti. In the magnificent fierce morning of New Mexico, wrote D.H. Lawrence, the old world gave way to the new.
So bring that adobe brick on wheels over to squeaky clean car.
Modern New Mexico fetishizes its cultural past. Founded in 1610, Santa Fe is the oldest European city in North America. But here, the adobe style isn't just pervasive, it's mandatory. The law says you can't build a chain store or a gas station unless it's in the manner of a 17th century mission church. This goes hand in hand with the artiness of the place, stuffed with every kind of pious ethno-kitsch displaying its multi-culti credentials. To see earlier examples of artistic fusion on the southwestern frontier, it's better to go to places like the Church of San Jose in Laguna Pueblo. It was built around 1700, and its friars embraced Pueblo art. Indian designs along the walls lead to the florid altar screen with the sun, the firmament, and the moon on top painted in the Indian way, and the Blessed Trinity in Spanish style below them. On the right is St. Barbara, who protected you from thunder and gunshot wounds, a useful saint for Indians to have. In this fusion between European and Native American traditions, a rich aesthetic rises from cultural collision, and this would be very much part of the story of the arts in a nation made of immigrants. The priests secured the frontier. Then came Spanish settlers. They built their big, self-contained farmhouses or haciendas like fortresses to withstand attacks from hostile Indians. Made of adobe, most of these have perished, and this is one of the few that remain, Casa San Isidro. The early Spanish colonists led isolated and harsh lives in a culture of survival propped up by faith. Today, this is the home of Ward Allen Minge. What was this room?
This happens to be a chapel. I suppose it seems strange to us nowadays, but in the old Spanish homes, especially if we were large enough with a large family, they often had their own chapels such as this. It's very plain, actually, by those that you might find in Mexico or Spain, but it reflects, I think, the hard life that the settlers had here in New Mexico.
When the colonists, including the missionaries, were here, they were pretty much on their own, weren't they?
That's true, and the isolation is what many of us feel has resulted in a rather unique cultural expression that we find in this area.
The Franciscans encouraged images that were simple and direct, crudely carved, highly colored, full of sacrifice and death. You needed the impact to drive home religious doctrine. It reaches an extreme in a type of statue made by penitential cults in New Mexico known as Doña Sebastiana, Death riding in a cart. This skull-headed crone wielding her bow and arrow is Eros reversed. These death carts are among the most powerful and unnerving sculptures produced in North America. Spanish settlers brought to the New World the culture of the old. But there was a more radical idea to come. Americans as a new people for whom God had marked out a special role in human history. This came with another group, English Puritans, who landed on the cold coast of Massachusetts in the 17th century. The arrival of the Puritans was a truly mythic event. Mythic because it was meant to be. In the famous phrase of their leader, John Winthrop, they would build a city on a hill whose example would shine back across the Atlantic and reform the corrupt old world.
We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. We shall be made a story and a byword through the world.
Winthrop spoke those words in mid-Atlantic on board the ship Arbella. He believed his flock had been chosen by God to begin a new phase of human history, a renewal of the story of Exodus. These men, and women too, were biblical fundamentalists. They imagined their leaders as Moses, as Abraham, as elected saints. They were the first to call themselves Americans, and the society they created has proved absolutely basic to the way Americans imagine themselves today. New people and the beginnings of a new architecture. The four-square old ship meeting house in Hingham could hold the whole community, 700 people. This is the oldest church in New England. It's also the last surviving Puritan meeting house. Its frame was raised by the people of Hingham in 3 days in the summer of 1681, and it opened for worship 6 months later. It came to be known as the Old Ship Meeting House. Why the name, nobody seems to know, except that people must have been reminded by the great structure of the roof with its massive timber beams of the inverted hull of a ship, an ark. There can't be many oaks left in Massachusetts today big enough to supply the timber for these huge king post trusses. This is very pure architecture as befits its purpose. How long were the ceremonies here?
They'd be here for 6 hours on a Sunday, in 2 sittings on very hard backs, benches without backs. One can see in the mind's eye the women with small children here on their laps, the older people in the front, all of them centered on the Word. That's what was happening here. They came before a pulpit that would often have an eye painted on the front of it, which was God's omniscient eye watching them.
And this would be the only decoration in the church?
This would be very nearly it. They stripped away everything else, the stained glass words, all of them gone. It's interesting to see the light in this building. I was struck when I was in Wells Cathedral in England, where the Puritans had smashed the stained glass windows, and white glass remained, and there was a kind of intensity of that light, which one sees here. I think they wanted to see things clearly, directly. They wanted no intermediaries. There was a kind of seriousness and urgency about all of this, and it's made America what it is today.
These Puritans delighted in radical bareness. They would not tolerate graven images of God or the saints. Some of them must have felt sorry that New England had no Catholic icons for them to smash. Yet the meeting house does have its aesthetic. It exists to frame the spoken word, to which the visual image must forever defer. Simple gravestones were their only religious art and their only sculpture. Puritan society was fixated on death to a degree that modern Americans can hardly imagine. Today, we sweep death under the carpet. Then, it held the foreground of social life. funerals, whole villages would get drunk, and children were dragged snivelling to the edge of open graves to teach them that they too would die. The death's head on the stone reminded you that this world was only an anteroom to a real and eternal one, that its realities were insubstantial, its modest achievements all in vain. Puritans were at least as superstitious as the Indians whose beliefs they scorned. In their world, nothing was accidental. Good was part of God's plan, evil was the result of diabolic conspiracy. They lived in a world of omens and portents. They were obsessed by witchcraft. This hysteria started in 1692 during the ministry of Parson Joseph Capon. His house still stands in the small village of Topsfield. He was one of the few to try and save those accused as agents of Satan in the famous Salem witchcraft trials. Parson Capon tried to remonstrate with the witch hunters at Salem, but he failed, and the women were all hanged. His house in Topsfield still stands, and it gives you, with these low ceilings and the heavy beams, a strong sense of the kind of world that these people were constructing for themselves, intimate and close-knit and designed to keep the family in and the wilderness out. Built in 1683, the Parson Capon House is probably the best surviving example of Jacobean architecture in America. Its brick chimney was a sign of affluence for the times. The door is double thickness, clinched with nails against Indian attack, and this hanging finial was one of the few ornamental touches. The Puritans didn't invent a severe domestic style to reflect a severe ideology. Many 17th century English houses looked like this. But in other parts of their culture, we do start to see the faint stirring of something that can be called American. Farmer Henry Treat made this chest in 1673 to commemorate his wedding anniversary. So this is really the sort of earliest form of American furniture, the six-board chest.
The six-board chest is really the dumbest piece of furniture known to man. It's so simple to make, and yet this shows an early emphasis, a kind of yearning to ornament and to embellish, even amongst people whose situation in life was very tenuous and insecure. This was a frontier community on the edge of the wilderness. It's one of the earliest pieces of American furniture and the earliest piece of Connecticut furniture with its date carved right on the front.
From the days when the West was in the East.
When the West was in the East, right.
Well, when you first see it, it looks like it's just about one notch up the evolutionary scale from a packing case, but what...
It's pretty much, I mean, it's simple. This is no backwoods Michelangelo here. It's pretty dumb carving, essentially, but it works, and it creates quite an elaborate effect to an otherwise remarkably simple piece of furniture. There seems to have been this kind of love-hate relationship with nature. One imagines the Puritans as sort of 17th century Daniel Boones at home in the wilderness. A truer picture is that they probably hated the wilderness. It was an oppressive presence on all sides of them, and when they were in their domestic environments, in their homes, they wanted evidence of control, of order, and of artifice, so that they took wood and rendered it colorful, carved, decorative, and even mathematically structured.
The only kind of painting the Puritans encouraged was portraiture. How did they see themselves? This is the only known Puritan self-portrait. It's a Boston mariner in the 1680s, Captain Thomas Smith. The lace at his throat tells you he is well off. The scowl that he accepts his impending death. Under the scowl, the poem reads, why should I the world be minding? They're in a world of evils finding. Then farewell, world. Such portraits were made as a record, to commemorate a person's social place, to honor his memory after death, and to remind you of the transience of life. Some Puritan effigies, to put it mildly, lack the zing and suppleness of European portraiture. They're awkward shades of virtue, or else they're an index to wealth. These are the Freaks, a pair of New England yuppies in the 1670s. Mrs. Thomas Freak holds her baby, Mary. The nameless painter has done them in an old-fashioned Elizabethan style, flat and formal, but with every detail of lace and jewellery carefully listed. She's a trophy wife, and her minxy little face radiates delight in her status. Her husband, John Freak, a rich young Boston merchant, is just as grandly kitted out with his lace and gloves. Money was a sign of God's approval, so why not show it off? Thus, the Puritans left the first portraits of individual Americans.
For we must consider we shall be as a city upon a hill.
It is a mistake to think of the Puritans as conservatives. The truth is very nearly the opposite. They invented the idea of American newness, imagined as the sign of a special history. Newness underwrote the American Revolution, and it was the root of the long-lasting belief that Americans are a special case. But they believed in freedom for themselves, not for others. They were not very tolerant or democratic. The legacy of those admirable traits came more from other settlers who arrived in what is now Pennsylvania. This is a meeting of Quakers. No sermon, no singing. They wait patiently for the inner spirit to reveal itself.
I feel much blessed to be in this room with seekers. We have peace. We have beautiful surroundings, comfort.
The Friends settled in Pennsylvania in 1682. They hoped to create a haven from religious persecution, not just for themselves, but for all Protestants. Quakers distrusted the arts, but their ideal of a pluralist society shows in the works of one of their few painters, Edward Hicks. In his numerous versions of the peaceable kingdom, Hicks showed the biblical prophecy that the lamb and the leopard will lie down with the kid, and a little child shall lead them. In the background, the colony's founder, William Penn, is signing a treaty with the Delaware Indians. Tolerance really mattered to the Quakers, as it didn't to the Puritans. William Penn made Pennsylvania a haven for any and every Christian sect that wanted to create a new life in America. They came from Switzerland, Germany, and France, as well as England. They were Mennonites, Hutterites, Moravians, and Amish. The Amish especially have stuck to their traditions, rejecting worldliness and modernity. Indeed, they shun the lens of the camera. The less messianic migrants, known to their conservative neighbours as the Gay Dutch, brought with them the bright heraldic designs of German folk art.
There was no desire to express anything through the art. It was simply to decorate something that they were going to use. Pennsylvania German folk art has to be seen as a copycat art. They imitated a great deal. They copied designs from anything they saw. And you know, one of the designs that came into Pennsylvania German folk art is the unicorn. And a lot of ink has been wasted on the subject of its symbolic meaning. In fact, if you look at it very carefully, it's simply a unicorn taken off of British design elements, coats of arms.
It's from the Lion and the Unicorn.
Precisely! You can even find the lion as well. I know a piece of Proctor that has two unicorns facing each other, and down underneath it, two lions facing each other. They disassembled the original and reassembled it to match the Pennsylvania German fetish for symmetry.
Like Norman. He likes to quilt. Sometimes it's just symbol isn't big enough.
Of all the folk arts, one flourished especially among the German migrants and was the work of women. It was the quilt.
He was just going against the front one.
A lot of these ideas came from Germany. My parents died when I was very small, but I lived with my uncle and aunt, and the aunt was a great quilter. She did a lot of quilting, and so, of course, I had to learn how to quilt. And I do enjoy it.
The quilts that have attracted the most attention were made by the wives and daughters of the Amish. They're grandly abstract. You can't look at these Lancaster quilts and think, how cute. You may think, how modern. But no, to the Amish, newness was and is anathema. Nevertheless, the work of these Amish women was as much a part of the story of high aesthetic effort in America as any painting or sculpture. They refute the idea that folk art is just innocent social birdsong. Today, the popularity and price of these quilts and of Pennsylvania German folk art in general just grows and grows. It reminds modern Americans of their roots, real or imaginary, in a simpler, pre-industrial time.
46, 46.50, now $4,700, $390, $490.
Americans couldn't bear to live in such a world, but they like to be reminded of it. The great example of this is in the work of the Shakers. Everyone wants Shaker objects, but very few want to lead the Shaker life.
And the number is 182, right there. Sing on, dance on, followers of Emmanuel. Sing on, dance on, you followers of the Lamb.
By the mid-19th century, there were more than 100,000 Shakers, but today there are just 8. This is the last Shaker community. It is at Sabbath Day Lake in Maine.
I'm glad I am a Shaker, I'm glad I am a Shaker, I'm glad I am a Shaker, ye followers of the Lamb. Sing on, dance on, followers of Emmanuel. Sing on, dance on, ye followers of the Lamb.
Founded by Mother Ann Lee when she came across the Atlantic in 1774, they were called Shakers because of their quivering dances in which the spirit seized them.
Followers of Emmanuel. Sing on, dance on, ye followers of the Lamb.
They believed in complete sexual equality and hoped to restore the primitive Christian church on American soil with its stress on community, celibacy, and the indwelling spirit of Christ. Unlike the Amish, the Shakers did believe in innovation. They invented the washing machine, the flat broom, and stay-pressed clothes, among other things, because labor-saving devices left you more time to pray. They embraced the new, they equated it with piety, and they sought it in design.
I think that in order to explain why, and I say this with modesty, why the Shakers have made such beautiful, beautiful things is due to
to the mottos that we have been given to live by. The first, of course, is hands to work and hearts to God. And this is literally lived out in Shaker communities. And the other is, do all of your work as though you were going to live 1,000 years and yet as though you were going to die tomorrow. And when I go through the museum, which I still do occasionally, and I see these beautiful, beautiful things that are there, I think, when people made these things, they didn't make them thinking they're going to be in a museum. They didn't make them and put them in a museum. They made them so well, and they made them well because they integrated their religion into it. I'm convinced that religion and work has gone and hopefully continues to go hand in hand with Shaker arts, crafts.
People talk about a Shaker style, but really I guess the fundamental question is use, isn't it? It's what the thing is used for that dictates how it's going to look.
Exactly. Form indeed does follow function for a shaker. And so we have many, many things here that have really stood the test of time for several reasons. One, A, they were made well, and second of all, they've always been used well. And although the pieces in our museum, like this Taylor's bunk...
Taylor's bunk?
Bunk. Yeah,
this is a Taylor slept on it?
Well, no, actually, it's just good old Maine country terms. It's spelled B-E-N-C-H, but it's pronounced bunk. And this is a piece that is designed for tailoring on, cutting out all of your clothing and cloth.
And there's no way of improving on the design.
No, it's as simple as can be. Nice, large cutting surface and ample storage underneath. Schools like the Bauhaus and then modern Danish that pick up on it too also saw that likeness, the elegant design really that was inherent in
just that fining down of proportions.
Exactly. I mean, you have the most perfect example of that is a chair that came from the Enfield, New Hampshire community. Literally so light that it can be picked up with one finger.
What does that weigh?
Probably about 5 pounds.
5 pounds.
And it's set back again, it's totally refined. Flame finials, these were really the finest chairs that were ever produced in any of the Shaker communities. Something that adds to that overall effect too was that they cane the seats. So you have even more air playing
through. Even more transparency.
Exactly.
And a lot stronger than it looks.
Very much so. Someone over 200 pounds would not have a problem sitting in this chair or harming it.
Well, I'm not going to try it, but...
Take my word. Also something else, when we talked about inventions, this was a very practical Shaker invention, and you talk about form and function. People always are going to sit back in their chairs, no matter how you try not to.
So what are these?
So these are called tilters, ball and sockets. And it allows you to, indeed, tilt. And as you tilt, you see the chair does not actually move.
Oh, yes.
So you're not going to destroy the chair,
so it's not going to skid forward,
And, probably you also won't go down with it.
We will sustain a structure, God's great and glorious plan, which He embraced.
These people have sustained the structure, kept intact their utopian vision of religious community. But the broad currents of American history rose around such ideas, isolating them. Their New Jerusalem of no mine or thine, no masters or servants was the exact opposite of what by then had been created down south in Virginia. Here in Virginia, the Middleburg Hunt keeps alive quite different English traditions. This was the outcome of another migration. A world of transplanted squirearchy, the Percys, Throgmortons, Wyatts and Spencers, mostly second sons or dispossessed gentry, the royalist cavaliers who had lost out to the Puritans in England's Civil War. They wanted to recreate aristocratic privilege in America. They brought indentured servants and later African slaves. The top of the pyramid had to import its base. This is Mount Airy, seat of the Taylor family. Mrs. Taylor's forebears came here in the 1680s. But you never really lost your family never really lost its feelings of contact with England, did it?
No, indeed, we're all Anglophiles. Right now.
Yeah, what does the sort of idea of England, the mental picture of England, what does it mean to you?
It means a great deal to me because my grandmother taught me more about England than she did about America. I could recite the kings of England and never did learn the president of the United States.
Oh, for shame.
Yeah. No. I loved England.
But did you ever live there?
No. I've only been there twice.
Early Virginia was a fantasy, so Walter Raleigh promoted it as a Garden of Eden which aristocrats could colonize without having to lift a finger. Floundering through the salt marshes in embroidered doublets and silken hose, both his expeditions ended in disaster. Finally, in 1607, a kind of settlement did take hold in Jamestown. It was an anarchic dump where men died of starvation, swamp fever, and dysentery. This sickly colony was saved by a harsh doctor, Governor William Berkeley. He arrived in 1642 and set about re-establishing the aristocratic order of power and patronage. He recruited royalist refugees desperate to leave Puritan England. These distressed cavaliers, as they were called, turned into the colonial oligarchy of Virginia. They were its first families. They were enticed here with free land and spectacular promises of privilege. They planted tobacco, or the saltweed as they called it. They got rich. One of the richest of all these clans was the Carters, who ended up owning scores of plantations, and this was one of them. It's called Shirley. Originally, this front drive used to be the back entrance, and visitors came to Shirley up the James River. When you first see it, you think of the homes of the English Georgian gentry. It started in 1723, a brick box with English Palladian porticos and pediments, topped off with a mansard roof built by French Huguenot carpenters. An odd hybrid which stares across the river with great assurance. Places like this weren't big by English standards, but in Virginia they were very grand indeed. The flying staircase framed a hall where formal dances were held. Virginians entertained lavishly, and one royal governor congratulated himself that there were no bad dancers in his administration. After the ball, they would retire to this parlour to gamble and gossip and perhaps to congratulate their late Governor Berkeley for banning free schools and printing presses. The Puritans had passionately believed in general education. The Southern Cavaliers were against it. It might disturb the hierarchy of class, at whose peak stood men like the patriarch of Shirley, Robert Carter, known as King Carter. He was the richest man in the colony. He owned 1/3 of a million acres and set up his very own church, Christ Church. This is one of the most elegant classical buildings of the early 18th century in America, but nobody knows its architect's name. Its detail is perfect, right up to that massive, slightly flared hip roof, cushioned on its cornice. Inside, it's just as good. The plan is a stubby cross with the altar at one end, and the light washing over those white barrel-vaulted ceilings gives it an almost Venetian effect, whose calm is emphasized by the thin, dark cornice line. The sermons from this pulpit, unlike Puritan ones, were mercifully short.
This is where the Carters came to worship. The sides of its pews are the highest of any church in America, and this served a double purpose. First, it enabled the Carters to concentrate without distraction upon the word of the Lord coming from the pulpit up there, but secondly, it stopped the lower orders from peering in on them.
This society of deference and hierarchy was scoffed at back home by the English. They saw through this wannabe aristocracy and its pretensions, and indeed, the way Virginians pictured themselves was largely a fantasy. In a painting by Justus Engelhardt Kuhn, one of the sons of this oligarchy, Henry Darnell III, is put in an idealized garden landscape, probably copied from some European print. All of it is fiction. No American property ever looked like this. The image records the defiant, illusory desire of this colonial gentry to imagine themselves as a full extension of English culture. A young slave gazes at Darnell with submissive adoration like a favorite dog. This genteel surface of hierarchy was stretched over a fabric of brutality supported by slave labor. At Mount Airy, Mrs. Taylor's ancestor, John Taylor, owned 380 slaves, the largest gang in the colony. In the dining room there hangs a portrait of the master by John Wollaston.
I don't think John Taylor up there sat on a veranda and drank too many juleps.
Yeah, he looks pretty tough, actually. He looks like a very
busy person.
He looks like a very self-possessed man.
He's all dressed up now, but I don't think he was too dressed up all the time when he was riding over his places.
I would imagine not.
He had to tell people what to do and how to do it. Somebody had to have some brains.
And so some Virginians could pursue their ideas of freedom in this newfound land. Realizing freedom, however you defined it, was the basic desire of all these early colonies. And after religion, the second freedom was the liberty to create wealth. And culture followed money, as it always does. As the colonies grew, they grew rich through technology, through trade. In the 18th century, Massachusetts and Pennsylvania swelled in foodstuffs, metals, tea from China, slaves from Africa, rum from the Caribbean. Wealth and worldliness. But most of the material culture remained steadfastly English in appearance. While the colonies started to pull away from England, cultural independence didn't come in a rush. It was gradual, and signs of it appear by the 1760s like small portents.
The first American art that began to lift into real originality was furniture, like this great bureau table in mahogany made by John Townsend in Newport around 1765. It's meant as an image of material splendor, but it's completely unlike anything in the existing English pattern books. It doesn't look or feel like English furniture. The big difference is in what's called the block front, which is basically the stack of drawers sawn from great solid blanks of mahogany, bulging out at you. This is why it commands space with the kind of authority that it does. It's almost architectural, and the block front style, as it was called, celebrates really the immense abundance of the American forests, the forests of the New World. This is the delayed Baroque that Puritanism suppressed, rich as architecture, arriving in the middle 18th century. But better late than never.
Painting was slower to evolve, but in the Bermuda Group, a portrait of Bishop George Berkeley and his family, John Smibert showed how American art might begin to detach itself from its stiff early colonial conventions. It manages to set figures in a natural way in space, unifying them with light and air. On the left, a friend takes down the bishop's words of wisdom, for Berkeley was a strong believer in American destiny and had written, "There shall be sung another golden age, the rise of empire and the arts, not such as Europe breeds in her decay, such as she bred when fresh and young." By the end of the 1760s in the east of America, the tide of religious zeal had ebbed, but the desire for liberty which had brought so many diverse colonists to these shores remained. It was so strong that it was a wonder to Europeans, one of whom, a visiting Frenchman named St. John de Crèvecoeur, posed a famous question. Who then, he asked, is this American, this new man?
Visit American Visions at PBS Online and further explore the American experience through art at the address on your screen. Over the coming weeks, American Visions continues with the remarkable story of how art has evolved in the drama of American experience.
In the eyes of 19th century Americans, the New World, their world, had no ruins or monuments, but it had something better, places like this, which proved that God had written the immensity of his designs right here in America. Nature, not culture, was what made Americans American. The Civil War was the world's first great modern war, total and fought at the limits of an expanding technology of railroads, breech loaders, repeating guns, and ironclads. It seemed to run of its own accord, a thing with its own will, swallowing the men in blue and grey as a furnace swallows coal. In the end, it killed more than 600,000 young men. It was America's Iliad. It was America's Holocaust. And it changed the country forever. This has to be the most intensely felt image of military commemoration made by an American. O grave, where is thy victory? For me, without exaggeration, this is the most beautiful American house since Jefferson's Monticello, and it becomes so by its play between nature and culture, with those great forms seeming to hover above the elements of nature and yet rooted in them. But the greatest American artist of the 1930s didn't paint collective experience. A solitary, deeply inhibited man, he focused on lonely people in an indifferent world without much social connection. His name, of course, was Edward Hopper. There hasn't been a painter in the 20th century whose work was more associated with the look and feel of a certain kind of America, a basic America that has nothing to do with the rhetoric of patriotism, but goes much deeper. Is it a hypodermic needle? Is it Buck Rogers' spaceship on the launch pad? No, it is the Chrysler Building, commissioned by the Detroit automotive tycoon Walter P. Chrysler as a paean to the cars that made him rich. It's sheathed in polished metal and decorated with emblems of the auto age, gargoyles that are huge radiator caps, and a frieze of hubcaps like solar discs running around the 30th floor. Since the late 70s, Terrell's big project has been to turn a whole crater on the edge of the Painted Desert in Arizona into a work of art. Inside this great volcanic hill, Terrell plans tunnels, viewing chambers, and pools acting as lenses of water that will enable the visitor to experience the light of the sun, the moon, and the stars in isolated, concentrated ways. It's an American vision on an epic scale, not just painting the Western landscape, but subtly transforming it.
Visit American Visions at PBS Online and further explore the American experience through art at the address on your screen. American Visions is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Viewers like you, Rosalind P. Walter, the National Endowment for the Arts, and by
the Principal Financial Group, inviting you to see your financial plan as a work of art and draw on expertise in investments, retirement, and insurance. The Principal, where you can create a financial masterpiece.
United Airlines, we're working to make your entire travel experience easier, better, even more professional, both in the air and on the ground. Compared to the way you're used to flying, we're heading in a different direction. United Airlines, rising. BMW, driven around the world, admired around the world, and now exported around the world. From America. This is PBS.